audience and so forth. And we've got Channel 11 apparently circling outside in the parking lot, so we definitely want our TV Channel 11 to be present. But I'll get us started here. I'm Alan Clark. I'm Public Affairs Officer, and I'm proud to say this is our 11th Veterans Forum in a row, and we're delighted to have all of you here and joining us today. And I know that we're especially gratified to have a lot of nursing staff people here, number one, and the number two, some retired nurses. And we'll introduce all of you all at the end and have you stand up. And in fact, anyone that's a retired VA nurse, at the end of the program, I'd like to have you all have a picture with Mary Louise and Patricia and Marlene Huff at the end of the program. We'll send a copy to you all, so be sure we have your name and address. I always have some kind of a history with the program, some way or other, it seems. And my history with this program and Army nurses is I've been treated by a lot of Army nurses in my life, and always well. I guess my first Army nurses that took care of me was when I was 7 in an Army hospital in Sendai, Japan, had my tonsils taken out. And then I was in the hospital again at age 10 at Tokyo Army Hospital during the Korean War. And then appendicitis at the Fort Belvoir Hospital as an Army brat. And then, of course, being wounded in Vietnam, I came through I guess it was a MASH at Pleiku and Queen Yan, and then Clark Air Force Base, Travis Air Force Base, San Antonio Brook General Hospital. So I've always had a great affinity, if not even additionally love, for Army nurses. I can assure you, as many of us do that have been medevaced out, having been wounded or in combat or gotten sick in the military, and have a great affection and respect for Army nurses. So we're honored and delighted today to have this program honoring nurses. We have 2 Army nurses here today, as a matter of fact, but honoring nurses who have served in the military in peace and war. And this is really a program today to honor the nursing service at the VA Medical Center and the VA North Texas healthcare system. So in a larger and broader sense, that is really what we're all about today. I'd like to have all the people that are just personal special guests of Mary Louise that are here today, including her brother, Mr. Roberts, to please stand. Brother-in-law, I guess, I'm sorry. Brother, excuse me. Any of the guests, or just raise your hand that are special guests of Mary Louise that came today to the program. We're glad you're here, sir. I'd like to introduce Mr. Alan Harper, the Director of VA North Texas Healthcare System. Obviously, we would not be able to do these programs without the support from the senior leadership, starting with him. And we thank you, Mr. Harper, for your support.
Thank you, Alan, and I want to thank all of you for being here today and honoring us with your presence. And we especially want to thank Mary Louise and Pat for participating in the program today. And as Alan said, this is the first time that we've really honored our nurses in one of these Veterans Forums. And after 11 times, or 10 times, I guess it's about time we got it right, huh? Yeah. And I would just say for all of our retired nurses that are out there that I hope you're all jealous of this new environment. And if you want to come back, I bet we can find a spot for you. And that's what Miss Huff asked me to say to you this morning. But indeed, it is always a pleasure to have our retirees come back, and it's good to see a good turnout from our employees. And it's just a great thing that this is, and we're delighted to have everybody with us today. And I'm going to introduce Marlene Huff, our Chief of Nursing Service, and get on with the program. Thank you for being here.
Really a pleasure for me to be here, and I see, thank you, a lot of faces that I know from the past, so it makes me very happy to see you all here. American nurses have responded to the call to service in every theater since the Revolutionary War. Today, we, the nurses in the North Texas healthcare system, are proud and honored to be represented by this panel of veterans. And I'd like for you all to give them a hand right now. Now I'd like to ask Lieutenant Colonel Verdale Marsh, Army Reserve, to come forward and lead us in the invocation.
Bow your heads, please. Dear God, we just thank you for this opportunity to come in this place of service. We come with grateful hearts and humble hearts. And we just thank you for providing this facility to serve the veterans who have served our country. And we thank you for the combat nurses here today who have so honorably served thee. And we thank you for all the veterans that are represented here today. We ask that you would bless them. And we also ask you to bless the soldiers today who are in a war that we have never fought before. But God, we just ask you to give us courage to fight an unconventional war. And Lord, we ask you just to bless America. And it's in my Savior's name, Jesus. Amen.
And now I'd like to ask Josie Pollan, who is Lieutenant Colonel in the Army Reserve, to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Thank you, brother. Let's all stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And now, will Rita McClure please come forward and inspire us with God Bless America?
God bless America, the land that we love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above and from the mountains, through the prairies, to the oceans, white with foam. God, please bless America. It's our home, sweet home. God, please bless America, our home, sweet home.
Thank you very much, Marlene, for getting these wonderful participants in our program. We thank all of you that participated in our program. If there's anybody in the back, please, standing up, just come on and move up anytime, and feel free to be seated. Our two participants on our panel today are Mary Louise Wilson, who was a nurse, Army nurse in World War II, and you will learn about her history as we ask the questions. So I'm not going to go into any formal introduction that will be repeated by the answers to her questions. And Patricia Walford, who is an active duty RN with us in our quality management service and served as an Army nurse in a mobile Army surgical hospital in Vietnam. So we'll get into both these Q&A. We hopefully will have an opportunity for questions from the audience. Just depends on how our time frame goes, because it's not totally rehearsed by any stretch of the imagination. I'd like to start by asking you, Mary Louise, about why did you become a nurse, and what was your reason for being motivated for this career field?
You know, there were very, very few opportunities for women in the early part of 1930. You either had to be a school teacher, a nurse, or a waitress. So I chose to go into nursing because I wanted to learn how to do something to help my family.
Tell me about how old you were when you got into this career field, and how you answered questions relative to the career field.
Well, I was 17 and a half years old. You had to be 18 to go in training, so I lied just a little. Then, when you got out of training, you had to be 21 years old to take state board. So I lied again a little. But after I got my diploma, I straightened it out. Now everybody knows how old I am.
Tell me about the support for your family in those first years after you got your nursing diploma, Mary.
Well, actually, this was more of a family affair. My oldest brother went into the Army, so he helped. I helped. My mother helped. And then, when my youngest brother, who is the old man sitting on the front now, when he was old enough to push a mower, he started mowing lawns. I did not fully support, but I certainly tried to do my part. And it was very difficult because in the early 30s, it was difficult for anybody to get a job. And my father had died earlier, so it became quite a problem. But as a family, we survived.
Thank you very much. Patricia, tell us a little bit about your motivation for becoming a nurse and your preparation for becoming a nurse.
Well, I can't remember ever not wanting to be a nurse. I think it was in the genes. When I was in the 6th grade, I was running around classrooms filling first aid kits. And when I was in high school, I formed the Future Nurses Club and took Latin and things like that. I mean, I can't remember. That's what I was meant to be.
What was your exposure to the military or to the veteran world prior to your going into the military?
Well, I grew up in a military family. My dad is retired Navy, 23 years, and so I was born in San Diego, of course, because he was Navy, and every other tourist that went back there. But we traveled, and I grew up military. I grew up patriotic, still am.
Where were you on Pearl Harbor Day, Mary Louise?
I was at home. I was in my home at 1218 North Bishop here in Dallas. I had a day off.
What were your emotions that day when you heard what had happened at Pearl Harbor?
There were 2 nurses that were real good friends of mine, and they were in my room. And when we heard of that, we said, well, I guess the next thing's war. But if it is, we're ready to go.
Pat, why and how did you become an Army nurse?
I was the oldest of 5 children, and when I was in nursing school, and the recruiters came around and said that they would pay for your last year in school, I thought that was a good opportunity. I tried to join the Navy, but they didn't want me because I was in a diploma school, and they only took baccalaureate nurses, so I joined the Army.
What was your commitment required for the Army service as a nurse?
For 1 year of tuition reimbursement, we had to put in 2 years of active duty.
So, Mary Louise, after you were so kind of hyped up as the country was, did you volunteer and go on active duty immediately? I mean, just go down and sign up like some people are doing today?
I volunteered. Dr. Winans, who was a professor of medicine at medical school, was asked by the Surgeon General to form a medical group. And as soon as the word got out, he had no problem in getting volunteers for the unit.
And you went on active duty in 1942,
Yes.
as I recall. And where did you report for your first Army nurse assignment?
I reported to Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio.
And Patricia, now, how did you first become exposed to what we might call the opportunity to go serve as an Army nurse in Vietnam? How did that all work out for you?
I was stationed at Fort Gordon, Georgia, Augusta, Georgia, and I was working in the recovery room, the surgical intensive care combination. And the chief of surgery had just been asked to be the commanding officer of a MASH hospital in Vietnam, and he asked me and one of the surgeons if we'd like to go with him. So I volunteered.
Just, we've seen the program MASH about the Korean War, and the movie came out 30 years ago, and the reruns we see from time to time. Basically, what was a MASH supposed to do? How was it set up? What was the purpose for it in Vietnam?
Well, it was a little different in Vietnam because there weren't really any combat lines. A MASH hospital is meant to be close to the line and get the casualties right off the line or from the aid stations, and then they're supposed to then be sent to field hospitals or evac hospitals. But since we didn't have any lines, they just sort of put us in the middle of where they thought the most active areas would be as far as combat are concerned, and we got the casualties from wherever.
Now, Mary Louise, you went to your first overseas assignment to Africa, and you want to tell us a little bit about being assigned there and how you got there to your first assignment.
Well, of course, we were landed in Casablanca, North Africa, and that was our staging area before we went to Verdale. And we were assigned, as our first assignment was Verdale, North Africa. So we went by truck across the African desert, and there were 12 nurses to a truck, 6 on each side, no pads and no cushions, and it was 8 days. But each day around 5:30 we bivouacked for the night, and we arrived in Verdale 8 days later. And
How many hours a day were you in that truck for those 8 days?
well, we started about, I think it was 6:30 in the morning. We rode 50 minutes and rested 10. And we about 5:30 each evening we bivouacked, and they threw up the little kind of pup tents for us. And they sure were pup tents.
Well, many of you may know that Mary Louise has her own chapter in Tom Brokaw's book, The Greatest Generation. And one of the things that she says in here, you never want to see another tent again the rest of your life, right?
That's right.
You don't much like tents anymore, is the quote right at the beginning of the chapter in the book. And I guess it started with those pup tents in Africa. Patricia, you went to Fort Bragg. Tell us a little bit about your preparation and your deployment from Fort Bragg, and that assignment, and kind of like the delay that you had really in getting to Ankei. Tell us a little bit about that and what happened and what the culture was to get you all up there in those hospitals.
The purpose for meeting at Fort Bragg, number one, that's where the hospital was going to be deployed from, and people came from all over the country to form the unit, and so we basically met each other. We met the people we'd be working with. We formed everything. We got the supplies together. We went through what they call escape, evasion, and survival training, where you learned what you were supposed to do when something happened that wasn't supposed to happen, like giving yourself atropine injections if there was gas of any type, refamiliarization with firearms. We weren't allowed to carry firearms because we were non-combatants, but we needed to know what to happen just in case, what to do just in case. we basically just learned to bond as a unit, learned to work together as a unit, so that when we were there, there'd be no question about our working together. We'd know each other. We'd know how we work together.
You all had, how many total nurses and how many of you were females? And tell me a little bit about the personnel breakdown of that MASH unit, please.
There were about 17 nurses total, and 6 of us were female. There were 6 women in the whole hospital. There were less than 200 people total in the hospital itself. And that was mostly corpsmen, and we had support services for a supply and transportation and things like that. But as far as the clinical itself, we were physicians, nurses, and corpsmen.
I understand you had a little bit of a delay to be able to go to the 1st Cavalry Division area at Ankei. What was that related to?
Well, we went over by ship. We were on, it was about 23 days by ship. I learned to play pinochle. When we arrived in Quignon, there was an evac hospital there, 35th evac, I think it was. And they got the convoy together to go up to Ankei, and they wouldn't let the female nurses go because the General Kennard of the 1st Cav didn't want to be responsible for females in his area. So we would have been the first women in that area. And it took our commanding officer a month of fighting in order to have him approved so we could go up and join our unit. And actually that was on Christmas Eve that we joined our unit in Ankei.
Mary Louise, back to this, once you got to Bizerte, what type of living conditions did you experience? And tell us a little bit about the experiences that you had at that hospital. Did you come under fire and so forth at that hospital in Africa? Tell us a little bit about that experience.
When we first arrived, the nurses were billeted in a big old building. Now this was originally a Foreign Legion encampment, and then after that, the Germans were there before we were. And I can assure you that we never took over anything from the Germans that wasn't filthy. And the first thing we had to do was always clean. Then after we were there, we were there a short while when they moved us into little individual, they called them barracks and I called them huts. But there were 2 to a little building. And the furniture that we had was crates from the packaging of the materials. And we never really were under a lot of fire ourselves. Occasionally a bomb would stray and would come near our quarters. But we could see from our point, we could see in the harbor where all the bombings took place. And we always saw the results, of course, when we started getting patients.
When we talked, you mentioned something about it. At some point in time, you all were like cheering. I mean, was that, when did that happen?
That happens when we were in the big building, before we moved to our little huts. We all, the first night that they bombed, of course, we didn't know what was going on, so everybody jumped out of their cots, put on their helmets, and we all went to the front out on the porch, and you thought we were at a ball game. We just cheered for the sides all the time, and we watched one of our planes, and we'd just cheer when they'd do something. But we learned later that cheering was not what we're supposed to do. That we're supposed to protect ourselves.
And we'll get back to that and how you all did that when you got to to Italy. And obviously at that place, then you obviously treated a lot of the casualties that had been wounded from the bombing. Tell me about your encounter with Bob Hope at this time, one of those USO tours.
Well, now this is something else. Of course, this all was new to us. And our first night, we were very frustrated, and everybody trying to do a good job. And I ran into this man in street clothes. So I just very abruptly said, "Please get out of the way or get busy." Now, I had no more than got it out of my mouth till our CO said, "Lieutenant Roberts, I would like for you to meet Bob Hope." Now, you can imagine my embarrassment.
Did you get to see a show?
Oh, we saw several shows. And he was, I cannot say enough good about Bob Hope. He took the name and a phone number of some member of the family of every member of our unit. And when he came back to the United States, he called a family member and gave a report on each person. And that certainly was commendable.
Did you get to see him over there in a show? Tell us how you felt about that. Here we are, 28 years later, and he was still out there trooping for us.
He's still great. I mean, it was a wonderful experience, and I'll never forget it. I think he really embodies what entertainment has done or tried to do for the American soldier, and I have so much respect for him. Does a good show too.
Make any comments about the similarities or contrasts with that television program, MASH, and were there any hot lips hooligans in your outfit?
Well, my chief nurse had some similarities. But when we were talking before getting ready for this, I was wondering if it isn't because maybe you have to have similar characteristics to be in that kind of role. There were some similarities too, as far as you see people sitting around waiting for things, and that's what it was like. If the troops weren't doing anything, we weren't doing anything. If the troops were doing something, we were busy. So I think there are a lot of similarities in that, and the joking and everything, and it's more to just sort of bring you back to earth and make you realize that there are other things to think about. Try to get your mind off of where you are.
Define the attitude and commitment of your hospital staff.
Was terrific. I was saying how we had gotten together at Fort Bragg first time that a lot of us had ever seen each other, but the commitment was wonderful. You never had to ask twice. People worked together as a terrific team. Whatever needed to be done was done. The corpsmen were wonderful. If you had to work 3 days straight, you worked 3 days straight. People didn't complain. You knew that there was somebody there to watch your back too.
Mary Louise, you left North Africa then, and you went to your first 36 hours at Avellino. Would you tell us a little bit about that, the casualties?
When we arrived at Avellino, it was around noon. By midnight, we had over 300 patients just from the time we got there till midnight. And we worked around the clock for 36 hours. We subsisted on K rations and C rations. And I'm sure some of you older men are very familiar with that. And we had so many critical casualties. We had second chest wounds, abdominal wounds, amputation, traumatic amputations. And but when we first arrived, the stench of dead was present, because some soldiers were still in the streets, but we were cautioned not to disturb it in any way, because the Germans had put booby traps on some of the patients. And so, but our concern was not for the dead, ours was for the living. And it was tiresome, it was long, and the operating room worked 24 hours daily. We worked around the clock. But I think that our work was very rewarding, because we had, in 36 hours, we had 1,100 patients. And that is a lot of patients.
Then you went, tell us about the living conditions at Dragoni, where you went by truck. And, you know, we complain that the temperature is not exactly perfect, you know, in our offices and our clinics in different places. And tell us what you had to live through and what you had to experience relative to the environmental conditions at Dragoni.
Well, the first place, the nurse's truck took the wrong turn on our way. We went 5 miles out of the way. We were going along, and then we saw Rangers with helmets on in the trucks, ready to go. We passed gun emplacements. So we've gone 5 miles, and MP stopped our driver and said, "Where are you going? What are you looking for?" He said, "Well, we're looking for the 56th Evacuation Hospital." He said, "Oh, hell, man, that's 5 miles back." So we had to turn around and reroute ourselves, but we found it. The first day that we were there, it was beautiful. And we thought, oh boy, we've got it made. But that was beauty before the storm. It started raining the next day, and it rained every day that we were there. It was muddy, it was cold, it was damp, and it was just like we slushed through the mud all the time. And you know, I wrote my mother a letter and told her that I had the Arno in my letter, but of course it was censored. And when I got home, my mother wanted to know what it was that was running through my tear. So she had to wait a long time to find out that it was Arno. But we had, quickly, we filled up. And it was difficult, but that was the first time that we were completely under tents. And nurses were in little two-person tents. And we all kept the same roommate the entire period. But everybody was so glad to get out of Dragoni, because we had just seen rain and cold and mud. So we were thought we just got to go somewhere besides this.
Pat, tell us what type of casualties and conditions did you handle up there at Ankei, and how did they arrive, your casualties?
We got casualties by jeep, by ambulance, but usually by helicopter, medevac helicopter, gunship sometimes. And sometimes we even had a Chinook land. That's one of those huge double, the big helicopters with the double rotary. There you go. Unfortunately, they could carry a lot of people. The type of injuries we would normally see are the same that Mary had talked about. Of course, traumatic injuries, chest wounds, abdominal wounds, traumatic amputations. And then we had some unique things like punji stick wounds and white phosphorus wounds. And those were terrible because whenever they would burn as long as there was air to them. And so you had to cover them up or put them in water in order to keep them from continuing to burn the person even after they've been, taken out of the field.
For those that might not know what punji wounds are, the enemy in Vietnam had a habit of taking pieces of bamboo and sharpening it and sticking it in a hole or sticking it as a booby trap. And they would put human waste on it so that if you got hurt by it, you would get very bad infection. So that was what the punji wounds were all about. Punji stakes. Did you ever treat any South Vietnamese, Patricia?
Not really often. The reason was more for security because, as I said, there weren't any lines and there were kids and women and anybody could be used as a source of infiltration, carrying bombs or whatever. So the only time that we ever treated any South Vietnamese were, number one, when we weren't busy taking care of our own men, and when they've been screened very carefully.
Did you ever treat any enemy soldiers?
I remember one occasion where we did. It's very difficult because your responsibility is, I was a nurse, we're there to take care of people, but then you had mixed feelings because this person was trying to kill our troops, and so it was quite a difficult situation.
Did your hospital area ever come under direct fire? I know you mentioned there was a shelling of a signal company nearby.
We didn't come under fire directly. Of course, we were on the perimeter, and so they were always probing the perimeter. But on this one particular situation, our hospital is down at the bottom of this hill called Hong Kong Hill, and at the top of the hill was a signal company. And one night, they started shelling the signal company, trying to come into the perimeter. And what I remember, I'll never forget this because I think of the men up there as real heroes, because in order to stop the attack, they called in an airstrike on their own position in order to keep the enemy from taking it over. And I'll never forget that.
Well, Mary Louise, you were at Avellino and then Dragoni, and then you went to Anzio, and you mentioned to me that, of course, that you all went into the beachhead at Anzio originally, and then you had to come back and you had to go back again, and so you ended up on probably D+5, I understand, at Anzio, and you set up 3 miles from the water line where your nurse was. Tell us about your exposure to enemy fire and how you all grouped the hospitals on that beachhead.
We were 3 miles from the water. We were stationed between the water and the enemy. And they could see our unit from their installations. They kept an eagle eye on us. And what did you ask?
Well, you just tell us about how they grouped the hospitals together.
We were the first hospital open to take patients. But immediately following us were the 95th and the 93rd Bag. And we were, as I said, we were first. And we were, the first day, we filled up and with overflow from our triage by midday. But then, when the fighting became so fierce, they grouped the hospitals all in the same perimeter. And there were 6 hospitals on the beachhead. And our commanding officer, Colonel Blessing, was in charge of all of them, though each had their own commanding officer, of course. And I don't recall exactly how many we had the first day, but in the course of the first 24 hours, we ran out of blood, but it was quickly plentiful or replaced by the 6th Corps and the CBs. And we had so many chest wounds, and I don't recall just exactly how many we had the first day, but in the 36 hours, we had 1,150 patients. So it was a constant thing. And up until the latter part of March, the operating room worked around the clock, 24 hours a day.
I'd like to, at this time, read the citation for the Silver Star that she received. 18 February 1944, subject awarded the Silver Star to First Lieutenant Mary L. Roberts, 56 Evacuation Hospital, APO 464, U.S. Army. Mary L. Roberts, First Lieutenant, Army Nurse Corps, 56 Evacuation Hospital, for gallantry in action on 10 February 1944 near Nettuno, Italy. On that date, the 56th Evacuation Hospital was heavily shelled by enemy artillery, while Lieutenant Roberts was on duty as operating room chief nurse. The operating room tent in which she was working was hit. The tent and its equipment were damaged and 2 enlisted men were wounded. It's hard for me to read it. Dick, why don't you finish reading it for me, please? I get emotional at times and just finish it up.
The tent and its equipment were damaged and 2 enlisted men were wounded by shell fragments from airburst, which continued for approximately 30 minutes. Lieutenant Roberts exhibited exceptional coolness and outstanding leadership, and reassured the other nurses in charge and encouraged and urged them to greater efforts. Despite the impairment of facilities and the prolonged shelling, the vital work at 3 operating tables was continued under the inspiration of her conduct and her example. The actions of Lieutenant Roberts in a critical situation assured the uninterrupted continuation of activities and contributed in a large measure to the success of the operation. Her bravery and unfaulting devotion to duty and complete disregard for her own welfare are one of the best traditions of the military service and reflect the highest credit on herself, the United States Army Nurse Corps. She entered the military service from Dallas, Texas.
I want to add something. When we were on Angelo, we were under fire as we loaded to go to our location. We were under fire every day that we were on the beachhead. We had rates from 4, the minimum was 4 every day that we were on the beachhead. And we had a number of enlisted casualties, and one nurse, but no officer, no male officer was a casualty, but some of them were casualties, all right, but in a different way. But under fire was our menu for the day. And anybody who says that they weren't scared is just being naive. You get so tied up in emotions with your work that your own safety is secondary, but it's still there, and you're still have that anxiety. But the fact that you are so tied up with your patients that it's kind of secondary. But don't let anybody tell you they weren't scared, because they were.
Patricia, describe your experiences, and this will be the last question I'll ask you about Vietnam. Describe your experience as a nurse in that hospital. You talked to me about the description of the people that you treated, the severity, the kinds of things, the things that you had to undergo, and the memories that you have that were the most emotional and long-lasting for you relative to those you treated.
I think one of the things that you don't get used to probably is just the sheer numbers of casualties. The severity of the wounds, the type of wounds, you just wouldn't see in an emergency room someplace. It's not something that you can prepare yourself for. And I think also the youth. The soldiers are so young. I was 21 years old, and so many of the soldiers I was treating were so much younger than I was. Excuse me. You're I guess a mother, a sister, a significant other to a lot of people who are a long way away from home. The years of, and maybe a selective memory has made me forget things. There are two situations that I always keep coming back to. It sort of symbolizes the fact, number one, that where I was, there didn't seem to be an end. I didn't see a finish to what I was doing. I remember a helicopter pilot who was a bilateral amputee after his helicopter crash, who was in a gunship. He was early 20s, newly married, and I always wondered about what his life was when he went home, you know. And I remember a young man, 19 years old, multiple injuries, who died in my arms while I was there. And it was, I guess maybe these are just two of the memories that I still keep. Maybe they're symbolic. But they're experiences that stay with me.
Patricia, what have your peacetime experiences as a nurse with us meant to you?
When I moved to Dallas about 6 years ago from California, and I hadn't worked at a VA before. I hadn't any intention of coming to work for the VA when I came here. But I think it's probably one of the best things that I've ever done. When I was thinking about it the other day, I thought maybe it was my finishing something that I'd started and hadn't seen the end. Maybe I can see the end now. And also I have a personal goal to give the best possible care that can be given to our veterans.
Thank you, Pat. Mary Louise, you had very many dedicated years of service in wartime and peacetime, and you retired from work with us. What are your comments about having finished out your working career here at the Dallas VA and having this opportunity to continue your service to the veterans and military of this land?
Well, you know, I was introduced to the VA when I was overseas.
Building 60, first floor, core, zone B. 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 Building 60, first.
Okay, let me repeat the question. You served many great years with us, Mary Louise, and we're proud and delighted with the service that you gave the veterans here for so many years. And so the last question to you was your kind of follow-through comments as far as your service here at the VA and being retired from us.
One thing, I was introduced to the VA while I was still in the service. We had 4 nurses who had come to us from the VA. And they just could not tell me enough good about it. And what appealed to me was, number one, was that it had a good plan. And you had good retirement plan, you had good sick leave plan, you had the opportunity to advance. And so as soon as I got home, I applied at the VA, and my assignment was for January 1946. And I have no negative remarks about the VA. They were very good to me. I enjoyed it. And a lot of times we watched for patients to see if we could find patients that we had overseas. And I had one patient that was in my hospital, not only overseas, but he was in our hospital. And his name was Mr. Boatwright, and he was a paraplegic. And he even remembered Lieutenant Shaw's name, the nurse that was on his ward that took care of him. That was the only patient we ever really had that I know of. But a lot of times I'd get in conversations with them. When they'd come to the operating room, they'd have to wait out in the hall a little while, and so while they were out there, I always engaged in conversation with them. I had very little contact with the patients because my job was really to get ready for him. But many times I'd be out in the hall with them and exchange conversation with them and find out what outfit they were with and so forth. but it was a very rewarding experience. And I'm so glad that I spent the last 26 years of my nursing with VA.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it obviously was a very extraordinary program. And if there is the epitome of examples in American society of people who have dedicated their lives to nursing and to be in the profession of healing, and people who have served their country in war and peace, our two guests today would be the epitome of that. This concludes our program, and we have on the 9th floor in Building 2 at the far end down there, we're going to have the dedication of the conference room to Mary Louise, and any of the outside guests, please join us there for a small reception and that ceremony. And you know, we don't have a whole lot of folks here, any of the nursing staff, nursing service people. We want all of you all to be included. We would like to have any people that are in the audience that are retired nurses from the VA, we'd like for you all to come up and have a picture taken with Mary Louise and Patricia and Marlene and Mr. Harper. So I know there's at least 2 former nurses that served on our staff here, whatever. We'd like you all to come up. I want to thank you all very much for your attendance.